The Half-Life 2 beta is a topic that is hard to do justice on. The amount of research and dedication put into finding every bit of detail on it and making it accessible to the public is nothing short of astonishing, not to mention the wealth of videos on the subject. There's not much to say that hasn't been covered already in much greater detail by bigger and better channels than mine, but damn man, I needed to make this video. If anything, it's just an excuse to open the beta back up and go through some of these levels. So I want to take you back to a time where Half-Life was my life. I got my first desktop PC at 12 and was introduced to Steam. I was big into platformers at the time and hadn't played many shooters, but my friend at the time was telling me about this game Garry's Mod. I was instantly hooked, and this was Garry's Mod 12, so it was still a pretty primitive experience. I spent most of my time alone on sandbox single player, and even made some epic YouTube content. Ironically, this game that wasn't developed by Valve was where I fell in love with Valve's output. I saved up my allowance money and got Valve Complete Pack on a discount, and I can honestly say my life was changed after that. Fast forward a few months, and I'd beaten every Half-Life game and every Portal game. And between scraping the internet for even a crumb of info on Half-Life 3, I found out about the Valve source code leak. For those who don't know, in 2003, a 21-year-old German hacker stole the currently in development source code for Half-Life 2, Counter-Strike Source, and Half-Life Source, and leaked them online. Now, I'm not condoning stealing from mega corporations. Well, actually, I don't care. Honestly, thank God that this happened, because if it hadn't, we would probably still be mostly oblivious to the completely different vision that Valve had planned to be the sequel of Half-Life. A dark, foreboding atmosphere, creepy sound and character design, and the use of heavy topics like child labor and torture would make up the earlier version of Half-Life 2. The term Orwellian has been thrown around a lot to describe the beta of Half-Life 2, and while I hate the overuse of the term in general, it's certainly applicable here. One of my favorite twisted ideas that they had for this game originally was the Manhack Arcade. This is where citizens could come for entertainment and play a simulation where they control a manhack killing other civilians. Except the game was to imply that this wasn't a simulation at all, and was just a way to control real manhacks. The disturbing and bleak nature of the beta was honestly something I would have loved to have seen in the final release. The final game certainly isn't a walk in the park, but I personally welcome a Half-Life game that's more willing to mess with players' psyche and overwhelm them with dread. After all, I still think the original Half-Life, despite not being a horror title, featured way more horror elements than Half-Life 2. And that's something I think that's lacking from Half-Life 2 in general, with the exception of Ravenholm, but we'll get to that in a second. Half-Life was never a scary franchise of games, but the original certainly had a horror slant, kinda like id Software titles Doom and Quake. Something I hear pretty frequently in the Half-Life 2 beta community is that people just want what they can't have. And there's a reason this stuff was canned, and the final game is better off the way it is. While there's some truth to this, keep in mind that Valve had already settled on the Eastern European style of the final release by the time the source code leak happened, so it wasn't changed due to the criticism of the leaks. I think if Valve had stuck to their original vision for Half-Life 2, it possibly could have been better, or at least very interesting. Of course, this is all conjecture, because all we have are really old maps with broken and buggy scripting, and we'll never get to see what the original vision for Half-Life 2 could have been. But the maps we do have are really fun to explore, and the cut chapters seem like they would have been really fun to play through. A couple of those aforementioned cut chapters include the Air Exchange and the Borealis, which was a concept that was later used in Half-Life 2 Episode 2. There's also a few early revisions of the quote-unquote Quarry Town, which ended up being Ravenholm. It's interesting to go through these because the overall aesthetic of these maps is very similar to the Ravenholm we ended up getting in the final game, which kind of exposes how Ravenholm was one of the few holdovers from this period of development. Its dark atmosphere and vibe would have fit perfectly alongside some of those earlier level concepts had the game been finished. In the massive HL2 Beta mega build that you can find online, you can get the whole WC map pack that was leaked in 2003, which contains maps not only from the early original story, but maps dating back to 2001 and as new as 2003. There's a lot of good stuff here, including earlier versions of levels and maps that are far more suited to the feel of the final game. Chances are you've already downloaded this and messed around with it if you're watching this video, but if you haven't, I highly recommend looking through some of these. I think the early training room section is potentially my favorite bit of beta content here. I remember playing this map for the first time and just about shitting myself when this happens.
Cleverly done, Mr. Freeman, but you're not supposed to be here. As a matter of fact, you're not. Get back where you belong and forget about all this. Until we meet again.
As someone who genuinely feared the G-Man when I was younger, this still creeps me out today. Anyway, that's about all I wanted to share about the Half-Life 2 beta. I could go on for a while, but as mentioned previously, there's much more in-depth content on YouTube on this subject that I couldn't do justice. Just wanted to throw in my own perspective and have a fond look back on something that defined my childhood. I think I'll always be one of the people who believes that just maybe this older version of Half-Life 2 could have been even better than the amazing game we did end up getting. Still, in some ways, maybe it is better we got the product we did. Half-Life 2 is one of my favorite games of all time, and the old version not being finished certainly adds to the mystique of the lost Half-Life game we will never get.